We're coming to the end of 2022, and it's an interesting year in Dublin Fire Brigade history because it marks an anniversary that's often forgotten about, often overlooked. It's the 300th anniversary of the coming of professional fire brigades to Dublin. Since 1711, the city had purchased fire engines for its own fire protection. They hadn't set up a fire brigade. They'd simply bought the engines and gave the use of them to a private individual who was supposed to bring them along to fires, round up some people who could use them, and deal with fires in the city. Very, very bad system because there was no training, there was no kind of uniformity in the standards of the people who were involved. In England, the situation had begun to change. After the Great Fire in London in 1666, huge amounts of property were lost. Rich people became poor, and rich people don't like becoming poor. So they looked into a system to deal with major fires, major disasters in built-up areas. And the idea that they had was fire insurance, which was a new concept at the time. There was insurance for ships and shipping, but fire insurance on individual dwellings was a new concept. The idea was that you would go to a company, they'd inspect your house, they'd set a value, you'd agree a value on it, and then you'd pay a premium, an annual premium to the company. And in the event of your house burning down, the company would pay the value of the house, the property and the goods to you. That was a good system, but it couldn't work with the existing parish fire engines and the kind of make up as you go along system that they operated on. Just people being rounded up and bringing the parish pumps along. Some would know how to use them, most wouldn't. So the insurance companies decided that it was in their best interest to set up fire brigades and to train firemen to actually use the engines and to become proficient at their trade. And by doing that, to save the company money in the long run. The first of them in London, the first really successful one, was a company called A Hand in Hand. There was a bit of doggerel at the time that was the hand in hand the race began. Then came the Phoenix and the Sun, the Exchange where old insurers run, the Eagle where the new. Other companies began to see this as a potentially profitable business and to get into the business. It largely was London based and then began to extend into the British provincial cities. And it was as late as 1722 when the first British company decided to expand into the Irish market. And the company that did that was the Royal Exchange Assurance, the REA. Now, the REA set up an agency here in Dublin. They appointed an agent, and they set up what was called at those times a fire engine establishment, its own company, Fire Brigade. One of the things about the company Fire Brigades was that at the time people were largely illiterate. So imagery was a huge part of the fire insurance business. Imagery in the form of fire marks, imagery in the form of colourful uniforms, imagery in the form of getting people's attention and demonstrating that this fire insurance company was different from that insurance company or that insurance company. I have here a picture of a Royal Exchange fireman in the uniform that would have been worn when they came to Dublin first. As you look at it, you realise that it's the most impractical uniform for fighting fires. The white knee breeches wouldn't be a huge kind of addition to anybody, along with the small shoes, and the top hat was more for appearance than protection. But for many years, that was the uniform. It has elements that would carry on right through the insurance period. Each fireman carried a badge to show not alone which company it was from, but where he stood in the hierarchy of that company. And we have one here with a possible provenance to Dublin for the Sun Insurance Company. Now, this is a Sun Insurance Company fireman's mark for badge number 12. And to this day, firefighters in Dublin Fire Brigade and most fire brigades carry a badge number. And it's still, I suppose, its origins link us back to the insurance fire brigades, and they're literally badge numbers. This would be worn on the sleeve of the uniform or occasionally on the leather strap worn on the uniform or on other clothes. The other implements that they brought, they began to professionalise the fire service. They began to look at the equipment that was used and either adopt tools from other trades for it or develop tools within the trades. One of the basic things, and you see it on the REA fireman, is an axe. And again, standard part of firefighters' equipment to this day. In the 18th century, the axe used was one like this. This is a boarding axe. It's the same pattern as was used by the Royal Navy at the time. This would have been very familiar to anybody in Nelson's Navy and in those years. It was a tool that was used on board ship, partly as a tool, but would also be used in the event of fighting and close quarter fighting on ships. If one ship was attempting to take another at close quarters, this was the preferred weapon. But it also carried a number of really useful features in firefighting. It could be used to cut through materials, it could be used to make holes in materials, or to give a fireman a grip on material that needed to be pulled, or even to prevent him from falling. So that is still very recognisable in modern firemen's axes, but this particular one, as I say, is an 18th century, early 19th century piece. The other thing that they began to think about in terms of protection for the firemen was helmets. As you can see, the initially beaver hats, the top hats would have been worn. Now, they would have been waterproof. They would have had a very, very small protection against falling slates or falling bricks. But very soon they began to develop the idea of an actual fireman's helmet. And this would have been one of the very first fireman's helmets. It's an 18th century piece again. This one is very similar to the type used, and quite possibly is one of the ones used by the Sun Insurance Company in their provincial branches, which would have been places like Dublin. The interior would have been stuffed with horsehair, and there would have been a leather flap at the back to prevent sparks or hot water or melting lead from going down the back of a fireman's uniform. So that's probably the earliest fire helmet in the country. The companies liked to have their emblems on any items that they used, even to the extent of fire bucket, like here, this one here, the REA 1720. That particular bucket, although it's dated 1720, that's more to do with the date that the company was founded. The bucket is a riveted leather construction, which would be late 18th century. An earlier bucket would be this type here, which would be hand sewn, but again, a fire bucket as used at that period. They marked the houses that were insured. Again, symbolism was very important. There's no point putting a sign on a house to say this house is insured by the Sun Insurance Company, or this house is insured by the Royal Exchange Insurance Company, because by and large people couldn't read. So you adopted symbols, and those symbols became synonymous with your company. In the case of the REA, it was the actual Royal Exchange. This is a later REA. Later on, we showed some early versions. It actually has an image of the Royal Exchange. These, initially, when they were put up, although these ones, the lead ones, tend to discolour back to a kind of a natural, neutral grey. They would have been quite colourful. The remains of the gilt, which would have been on the Royal Exchange, and the red background can be seen on this one. That's from about 1810. We have another one here, an early Sun mark. And again, very much using the imagery of the Sun. The Sun were one of the bigger companies. The Sun still exists in modified form to this day. And that imagery, that sunburst, is still part of their market. This particular mark, the details are on the back of it. It was issued in 1799 for the premises, for a named premises. And it carries the insurance number on the front, the policy number. It means that when a house, this is in the time before the postal system and the number of houses. So the house wasn't insured, property wasn't insured until a fire marks was affixed to it, because that meant that it was that particular house that was insured. So in the early days, it was very, very important to have a fire mark there. If a fire started, people would see it and would send for that company's fire brigade. Initially, the companies would only deal with premises that they insured, and as such were customers and were entitled to the use of the company fire brigade. But over time, they fairly quickly began to deal with any insured property and then claim it back among themselves, claim it back from the other company. They'd also, again, as time developed, they would fight basically any fire in the area if there was no other call in the time. But insured property always had priority. Insurance companies insured property. Their firemen were there to protect the company's property.
One of the features of Dublin in the time of the insurance companies was the use of fire marks. Each company had its own image, its own symbol that it tended to use. Again, we spoke about this. It's not people are largely illiterate, so there's no point putting a sign up with, you know, the name of the house is insured by the Sun Insurance Company or whatever. So what you did is each company had a particular image that they used that was associated with them. And when a house was insured, the company would put a fire mark on the house to show that it was the insured premises. Because especially in the period before the postal service came in, it could be difficult to identify individual buildings on a street. So the fire mark ensured that that particular premises was the one that was insured. Now, the very first of them that would have been seen in Dublin would have been very similar to this. This is a Royal Exchange, an early Royal Exchange mark. And it has, you know, the image of the Royal Exchange. It also has, as a lot of early insurance companies do, it has a crown. Now, there weren't government companies, they weren't government backed, they had no particular right to use the crown as part of their imagery, but it was obviously a more loosely regulated thing in those days because quite a few of the companies tended to use them. The other thing they would have on the end of the panel here was the policy number for that particular premises, so that would be shown. Over time they changed. That's a mid 1700s. By the late 1700s, by 1790, they had simplified the mark to an oval mark, still containing a crown, but it's no longer a separate item. As you see on the other one, the crown was very susceptible to damage. Still, again, has the policy number here. Now, this is a mark which can still be seen, not this particular one, but an identical mark can still be seen in Dublin today. One of the very few that remains. At one time, these were very much part of the Dublin streetscape, but one of the few that remains is a Royal Exchange mark from the 1790s, which is on the Patriots Inn in Kilmainham. The mark would have changed again around 1810, and the Royal Exchange went to this mark. We've looked at one of these earlier, one that had more, the remains of more colour on it. This is a simplified version, what collectors call a keyhole mark. The Royal Exchange, a lot of insurance companies changed their marks in the early 1800s, especially around 1810. They changed to this in 1810. It uses less lead. It's a simplified mark. Other companies like the Sun and other companies went to tin marks at that point. And the reason for it was the price of lead had shot through the roof because the Napoleonic Wars were in full swing and lead was a munition at the time. So the price had escalated. On the Dublin streetscape at the time, if you were to walk through one of our Georgian streets, you would see very, very vividly coloured fire marks. Now, we look at some examples later of later lithographed marks, which would give the kind of the visuals of what a coloured mark would look like. Most of the marks that remain, the early marks, were lead and tend to have faded back to the bare lead. The later lithographed ones actually show the colour schemes involved. If you were to walk down, as I said, a Georgian street in Dublin, you'd see a number of marks. Any house that was insured would have one. Some houses would have more than one. If the value of the house was more than any one company was prepared to take on, a number of companies might jointly insure various aspects of it, and each would have their fire mark on the front of the house. So it would have been very much part of the Dublin street scene. A few remain. I know myself in the last 20 years, I can think of two that disappeared. One in Capel Street, which was blasted over on the front of a building. Cement rendering was put over it to make the building waterproof. And in another case, one was actually removed, an Atlas mark was removed, where the building was being repointed, ironically to protect the heritage of the building. But in doing it, they removed an Atlas mark, and which was never replaced. We can look at some other marks and, as I say, show the colour schemes, show the vibrant colour schemes that would have been used. As I say, had you walked through Dublin 200 years ago, 250 years ago, 300 years ago, you would have seen these. They would have been very, very much something that would catch your eye. They had a number of purposes. One initially was to show that the house was insured and which insurance company you should send for. But gradually they developed other lives as well. They were really the first form of street advertising. Each company was able to put a sign on the outside of a house and say, this company is insured, by whoever. And if you were a person of means and went walking down one of Dublin's better streets where the ascendancy lived, the judges, the politicians, whatever, and you saw that particular companies predominated, you might be inclined to go to that company for your insurance. So they were a very early form of street advertising. In their own way too, they were a status symbol because it was shown to the world that, look, I have so much that I have to insure it. So it was probably the 18th century equivalent of parking a Porsche outside your front door.
The English companies from the Royal Exchange come to Dublin, they done well. They done so well that they actually had 2 fire engines in their fire brigade here, the biggest single fire brigade in Dublin at the time. By the 19th century, by the mid-19th century, there were 17 separate fire insurance fire brigades operating in the city, mostly one-engine brigades. The first Irish company wasn't formed till 1771, and it was formed by people who were businessmen in Dublin, who were men of property, and who, I suppose, realised that their insurance premiums were flowing out of Ireland, London, and decided that they might set up an insurance company and benefit from the premiums of themselves and others. And this is a mark from the first Irish company, the Hibernian. Again, carries the policy number, again, carries the crown. Quite a lot of this, as I say, a lot of early insurance companies tended to do that. I suppose it gave it a semi-official look, but there was actually no official reason for them to have that. The Hibernian used Irish imagery. It uses the Maid of Ireland harp as its image. Other insurance companies began to come along, other Irish companies began to come along, and in the early 1820s we had the National. Now, this mark is a tin mark, and again, it's not in great condition, but it can still be seen to be the National Insurance Mark, 1824. The image they used was the shamrock. That shamrock, generally speaking, would have been very brightly painted. It would have been dark green on a red background. So the imagery would have jumped off the wall at you. Later, as the company progressed, it toned down the imagery. And this would be late 19th, early 20th century mark. A mark like this would sometimes be used on a house, but other times it would be used in insurance offices to show that they were an agency for that particular company. So again, we still have the harp, we have shamrocks, we still have a crown, still floating on that one there. Other companies, again, the Irish companies tended to play up on the Irishness. The British companies were using the same images as they used in their UK branches. The West of England Insurance Company, which were down in Temple Bar, down in Crown Alley, the image on their fire mark was of King Alfred. So I'm not sure how many Dubliners at the period would have been awfully familiar with the image of King Alfred, but it was, as I say, it was the West of England mark, and they were a substantial company here in their day. This is another Irish company, again founded in 1824, the Patriotic. And the Patriotic kind of went to town on the Irishness. They have the figure of Hibernia here. It's a very stylized image and a very strange image for something that was done in 1824, 20 years before the Gordon Moore. We have the figure of Hibernia shielding her children with the horn of plenty, and the image of the old Irish Houses of Parliament in the backgrounds. It's a strange mix of imagery that will appeal to a certain sector, but would have no great kind of historical basis. And certainly when you think of the era that this was in use, it bore very little relationship to the reality of life in Ireland for most people. In later stages, the Sun Insurance Company would buy out the Patriotic, and at that point, the Sun made sure that it had its own imprint, regardless. The Irishness had left the mark. It was still the Patriotic, it was still an Irish company, but it was owned by the Sun. In fact, the company also used this mark, again, making sure that, Patriotic Assurance Company, guaranteed by the Sun, founded 1710. The insurance companies like to emphasize the longevity because it shows that they are established companies, that they have experience at what they do, and they're good by the very fact of the longevity. They're good at what they do. Where did they go? They went when Dublin was being redeveloped. They fell victim to collectors over the years. There was various phases where collecting fire marks was particularly popular. They fell victim to the destruction of Dublin, both the commercial destruction for redevelopment and the destruction caused by the events of the 1916 Rising and the Civil War. They would have accounted for a number of fire marks in that general area. They were stolen for their weight in lead in some cases. Some of the lead marks are quite hefty, and enough of them would make it worth somebody's while to steal them, in the same way as they'd steal lead flashing or whatever from roofs in those days. The most interesting one I've come across was in the collection of a friend who has a Hibernian mark, which was found at the site in Wexford of one of the great 1798 battles. There's no reason for it to be there. There's no town or immediate buildings that would have justified a fire mark. And his feeling, and he may well be right, is that it would have been removed from premises in one of the larger towns in the area, probably by somebody who was eyed up to the amount of lead in it, because that particular mark had been bent over. It certainly wasn't taken to be preserved. And it was probably taken with a view to being melted down to make musket balls. It ended up in the remains of a ditch in Wexford, and we'll never know the story. There's conjecture, but there's no way of knowing what the story of that particular mark was. As I say, 100 years ago, as late as 100 years ago, there would have been a lot of fire marks around Dublin. In this day and age, there are still some that are an oddity, but they are still there in the Dublin streetscape. The insurance company fire brigades were a feature of firefighting in Dublin for 140 years. Like this year, Dublin Fire Brigade, the municipal brigade, is celebrating its 160th anniversary in 2022. But we forget sometimes that for the 140 years before that, the city was largely protected by insurance company fire brigades. There were also parish engines, but the parish engine system was charitably described as haphazard and uncharitably described perhaps as useless. The insurance companies were the backbone of the city's fire service. At one point in the 19th century, there were 17 separate engine houses around the city belonging to different insurance companies who would work together at larger fires, who would work alongside the parish engines, who would work alongside the engines owned by companies like Guinness's and some of the distillers and breweries who'd have their own in-house fire brigades. Over time, however, there were a lot of shortfalls in the system. There was no uniformity in terms of the type of fire engine used or the actual equipment used, different styles of hose coupling, different connections on the engines. So in a lot of cases, they could work side by side, but they couldn't feed one another. One couldn't feed water to the other. It came to a head in a number of fires in Dublin, and in particular at the Kildare Street Club in 1860, when a number of the club's servants died in a fire which put the Kildare Street Club out of action for quite a while. And the Kildare Street Club was the social hub of the British administration in Ireland and of the Irish ascendancy. And it brought very much home to them that Dublin needed a municipal fire brigade. Now, they were late to the game because Edinburgh had had fire brigade for 40 years at this point. Belfast had had one for 20 years. But they decided that the City of Dublin, Dublin Corporation, should have its own municipal brigade, and the Dublin Fire Brigade was founded in 1862. When the municipal brigade was founded, it covered the city within the canals. That was the municipal area, and from the docks to Kilmainham. So there was still a demand in the townships of Rathmines and Pembroke and Clontarf and other places for the insurance brigades, because the city brigade wasn't obliged to go there unless by agreement and on payment of fees. So some of the insurance companies remained in place for a number of years afterwards. And as late as 1868, I've come across records of the Royal Exchange and Sun Insurance, and I think the National, operating along with Dublin Fire Brigade at fires in the city. And certainly the chief officer at the time, Captain Ingram, in a report on one fire, stated that he regarded them as part and parcel of the city's fire defences. But gradually the need for them faded. The companies didn't want to pay the expense of maintaining a fire brigade when the city was already maintaining a similar brigade. They passed the responsibility on to, for looking after their customers, onto the city. And the insurance companies began to disband the fire brigades. Usually what they do was literally disband the brigade in terms of letting the men go. The fire engines and firefighting equipment, most of which were quite old by that stage, in some cases up to 100 years old, but they were generally sold at auction either to provincial landowners, people who had big houses in the country and then needed a fire engine in the event of a fire because there was no local brigade, or they could also use it for agricultural use, for watering plants, for filling ponds, emptying ponds. So they tended to be dispersed. The engines tended to be dispersed. In one case, as late as 1878, the Sun Insurance Company still maintained a fire engine in Dublin, but it was no longer operational. And in that year, they decided to donate it to the town of Tenby in Wales, where locals had decided to set up a volunteer fire brigade and had appealed to the Sun for financial assistance. So rather than giving them money, they gave them the Dublin engine. So it was shipped from Dublin, where it had served for many, many decades, across the Irish Sea to a new life as the foundation of the Tenby Volunteer Fire Brigade in Wales. The insurance companies were very much part of Irish life, not just Dublin life, because they very soon realised that there was business in other cities and even large towns, commercial towns around the country. And very soon you had branches set up with their attendant fire engines, fire brigades in Belfast, in Cork, in Limerick, Galway, places like Newry, which would have been a very active port at the time and had both the port facilities and the associated warehouses. So they weren't just the Dublin phenomenon, they were very much part of the Irish scene. One of the things that the Dublin companies did was they were each given what was called the Day of Marching each year, which was an advertising day for them, where they would parade their fire engine and crew through the city, a much smaller city in physical terms in those days. They are part of the story of the Irish Fire Service. We forget sometimes that when we remember that Dublin Fire Brigade is 160 years old this year in 2022, that for 140 years before that, the city relied largely for its fire service on the insurance brigades. And in the mid-19th century, there were 17 separate brigades operating. There were also parish fire engines. The parish pumps were still there, but their service was well-intentioned but haphazard at best, and utterly useless at worst. The insurance brigades were the first professional firefighters. As they faded out, as they left the scene, the municipal brigades in Dublin and elsewhere began to gradually take over from them. But there's a debt owed by the modern fire service to those who went before. And we should remember those insurance firemen in their 300th anniversary this year.